Golden Sun is a traditional turn-based fantasy JRPG game released for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. It has a lot of the familiar gameplay elements of a JRPG, like a 4-player party, spell system, and elements with weaknesses and resistances, but also has a couple cool little tricks mixed in, like they have these things called djinns, which add complexity to the battle system, and they have interesting overworld puzzles that you solve using magic outside of battle. One other interesting kind of special thing about Golden Sun that sets it apart from other fantasy games in this vein is the soundtrack of the game. Of course, there's always the obligatory battle fanfare music that always seems to have trumpets and brasses. Okay, that's enough of that. But when you listen to a lot of the tracks in the game, fantasy is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. To describe the soundtrack in a few sentences, it's very synthetic. It embraces kind of the chiptune and lower resolution music in the Game Boy Advance. There's a lot of electric instruments and synths. It can be really dissonant and chaotic at times. Certain parts of songs almost sound like they're in a guitar solo, which are really wild and kind of fun. It focuses less on, a feeling of epicness or fantasy, and has a more of adventurous vibe to it as well. It's got this almost rocking feel, these 4 teens that are gonna go on an adventure and save the world, man. This is so cool. In this video, I plan to review some of the musical techniques that make this soundtrack so interesting and unique and give it such a personality. As a composer, sometimes you come across a really good bass line or a good drum line or beat, kind of a loop that you might use a few times in a song, and it can be a bit tempting to use this for the entire song. But this is a bad idea, because if you just have the same kind of beat throughout the entire song, it's going to sound kind of the same and not very interesting rhythmically. It's going to feel like it's moving at a single pace. The drums and the bass have their own voices and deserve variation. Certain parts of songs in Golden Sun have these really complex and interesting bass and drum lines that have a ton of personality to them and are really fun to listen to. Here's an excerpt from the song that plays when you're in the location called Tundaria Tower. This is actually from the second game, Golden Sun: The Lost Age. Listen closely to the drums and the bass line, especially how kind of midway through it changes in complexity. This is really cool and unique. It sounds like some drummer here is really rocking out. It's a lot of fun. This combined with the haunting choir and these icy sounding bells make it a really cool song. Now, not every song uses this complex percussion. Even this song, you only heard a certain section of it where it kind of gets really intense and crazy, which is really good because you don't want all your songs just to be kind of like these crazy drum lines. Just a few parts of some of the songs make them really stand out and interesting from the others in the game. A lot of the music in Golden Sun makes use of extensive syncopation. Now, syncopation is kind of a vague term in music, but what I'm referring to here is what Wikipedia refers to it as, which is the use of multiple rhythms which are overlain on each other and in some way make part or all of the piece on an offbeat. Now, what is offbeat? Well, typically, when you're counting along to music in a measure, there's a unit of notes, and 1 or 2 of those notes will have kind of a strong beat to them. And that's usually the first note and kind of the note that's halfway through the measure. For example, in 4/4 time, the natural place for the stronger accents or stronger notes is on the first and the third beats in a measure. Putting the stronger notes or accents on the second or fourth notes in the measure creates this offbeat. The best way to convey this is probably through an example. So here's a drum line where the strongest accents in the measures are on the first and third beats in 4/4 time. Note that the blue triangles indicate the natural place for the strong beat, the kind of metronome pattern that you hear counting along, and the actual X's are like the strong drum points that actually either align with the blue triangles or don't align with them. And here's a second drum line where the accents are on the offbeats. You can feel that the second clip kind of has a little more swing to it, has more movement, and feels more interesting than the first one. So to me, what syncopation is taking both of these excerpts, assigning them to different voices and laying them over each other, so that throughout the song, the accents of different voices are always falling on different beats. One good example of a song from Golden Sun that exhibits syncopation is the song that plays in the Mercury Lighthouse. The opening section of the song features two distinct voices, one in the bass and these strings in the treble. Here is the bass line by itself, and with the strong points labeled in red, and these strong points are for the bass instruments and the drums as well. Now here's this bass line played on the piano with the strong notes exaggerated in volume against the metronome. You can see that in triple time, you can follow along the metronome beat, and that a lot of the strong notes are placed in between the beats, usually like halfway through the measure, like 1.5 notes in, instead of directly on a note. And now here is the treble line for the song, with, again, in red, the strong points kind of outlined. And take a listen to this on its own, and see if you can follow along with the strong points with the metronome. When you put these two voices together, along with the metronome count for the time signature they're in, you can see there's a lot of variation of where the strong beat and accents fall. This creates a really interesting rhythm that's fun both to listen to and to count along with. This can also make the music a little bit hard to follow though. I found some existing music that was actually in 2/4 time, which I think is incorrect. I think it should be in like 3/4 time, waltz time, but the syncopation, makes this effect that kind of confuses the listener a little bit. Syncopation is just one example of the many rhythmic techniques that are used throughout the soundtrack in Golden Sun. Here's an excerpt from the boss battle music of the game. See if you can keep count to this. I'd be surprised if you can. This song is really wild. There's not only syncopation and a lot of use of offbeat here, but also changing time signatures. This means that as you're counting along, the number of beats in a measure may suddenly change. There's also this interesting technique where they'll take the last 2 or 3 half beats of the measure and cut them off, jumping into the next measure. It's kind of like changing the time signature, but not really. It's more subtle and quick. I don't know if there's an exact musical term for this. I like to call it just cutting the measure. it creates this kind of jump that really catches your attention. It's a simple way to add rhythmic complexity. And it makes it really feel like a boss battle. It's this tricky and dangerous situation that's unpredictable. You have no idea what's going to happen, you know. The boss battle music in Golden Sun is also a good example of the last type I wanted to talk about, which is cacophony, or kind of complexity and dissonance in harmonics. Certain songs of the game have this kind of chaotic feel to them. They employ the first two things we talked about, like the complex drum and bass lines and the syncopation and rhythmic complexity, and also just adding a lot of dissonance and kind of wild harmonies. But there's always a balance, right? So a lot of the songs start off kind of slow and simple with an easy to follow melody, and then they'll have certain sections that are kind of like a guitar solo that are really crazy and hard to follow, and they'll go back to the slow and simpler sections. A good example of this is the boss battle music for the two antagonists, Satyros and Minardi. I always had trouble saying that guy's name. Hear from the clips I've shown here, as the song progresses, it becomes more and more chaotic and dissonant. It becomes really hard to find the progressions or find exactly where the notes are in the song, the strong and soft beats like we were saying earlier. Fittingly, the only song that can really top this in terms of dissonance, harmonic dissonance, is the song right after it, the final boss battle music. This song starts off in complete disharmony. It's chaotic and it's really hard to follow and really unpleasant to listen to. But then it quickly changes into this really intense and catchy motif. But then soon goes back to nonsense. Then starts to go back and forth between these two styles. It's very raw and powerful and abrupt and intense. It's really fitting for this kind of final encounter. The composer, Motoi Sakuraba, has also worked on a number of other games, and I feel this use of balancing between cacophony and harmony really shines through in some of his other works. And that's about it. Those are the three techniques I wanted to cover. There's a lot more interesting things that the soundtrack does. I didn't really talk about the instrumentation. It's a really cool sound bank for the time. There's, again, like I mentioned, a lot of synths, electric bass, and these like deep male choirs that are kind of present throughout the soundtrack. That's really interesting. There's also this interesting use of on-beat echoing or delay, which is where there's kind of like an echo filter, so the note reverberates. You hear it multiple times, kind of like fainter as if it's echoing, but they kind of position it in a way that the echoes actually fall on the next note. They do it especially with these flutes that creates this really interesting sound that's found in a couple songs too. Overall, I really like the soundtrack of this game. I actually never played through the full game. I kind of stopped about halfway through. JRPGs just really aren't my thing, but I just kind of kept listening to the soundtrack and finding all the songs to it and analyzing them like in videos like these. It's just a really fun and interesting style, and I really enjoy the composer's work. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.